was going to just go ahead and make the full guide videos for Evernight and Dan Heng PT, but I figured I might as well make a video discussing my more general thoughts on both characters and how they ended up at the end of the beta before I move on to the full build guide videos. So let's just jump straight into it, starting with Evernight. I think the community perception to Evernight has been really interesting, or at least the community perception that I've seen. In many ways, Evernight feels somewhat similar to Hyceland's and Ceredra in that she's a pretty restricted character, mainly made for one team, that being Casterus teams. And yet, I haven't seen nearly as much outrage about her niche situation. Don't get me wrong though, I don't think this is a bad thing. Personally, I don't think Evernight deserves to be treated the same as Ceredra, because I think she isn't as niche as Ceredra was. So, bravo community! Good on you for not freaking out or doom posting over Evernight. In short, I think Evernight is a mix between Anaxa and Ceredra. Obviously not in terms of her kit or anything like that, I just mean in terms of how niche she is, or how niche she isn't, I guess. Ceredra is obviously the newest shining example of a niche character who really only shines for two specific DPSs. And the reason she gets so much flack for this is because Hyceland's, who is also niche, is at least niche in a specific gameplay archetype. For Ceredra, she isn't tied to any specific archetype like the DOT playstyle, but rather is just tied to two characters who happen to use her kit well, which is why Ceredra's specificity gets much more backlash than the likes of Hyceland's. For Anaxa, he was also created to work specifically with Herta, but the difference is that Anaxa is powerful enough to stand on his own as his own DPS by separating from the Herta. Evernight is some sort of halfway point in between these two. She is made specifically with Casterus in mind, thus why many of her beta changes were about balancing her ability to charge Casterus' ultimate. So in that sense, she's similar to Ceredra, but she's also similar to Anaxa in that she's strong enough to stand on her own as her own main DPS, even without Casterus, just like Anaxa can stand without Herta. Now, the reason Evernight is still more niche than Anaxa is because Anaxa has many different team options as a main DPS. Sunday, Branya, Ceredra, Robin. There are a lot of different ways to build an Anaxa team, and he isn't tied to any specific character, thus making him a lot more flexible. This isn't quite the case for Evernight. Obviously, with enough investment or optimized gameplay, you can make Evernight work with accessible options, but Evernight really wants specific characters to pair with her, aka she wants to seal Casterus' premium team, especially Hyacinth. And this is where Evernight differs from Anaxa. With Evernight, you either slot her into Casterus' team by replacing RMC or Tribi, or you just replace Casterus with Evernight while really wanting the rest of the team to stay the same. For Anaxa, like we already said, his team options are a lot more flexible as a solo DPS outside of Herta teams. The reason for this is because Anaxa isn't the one with path restrictions in his kit. Herta is. Herta is the one who wants a second erudition character on her team, so Anaxa isn't restricted by that when he goes solo. On the flip side, Evernight is the one with the mono remembrance restriction in her kit, not Casterus, and thus, Evernight is the one who really wants to still be paired with remembrance characters even when she goes solo from Casterus. As such, Evernight ends up in somewhere of a middle ground between Anaxa and Ceredra in terms of how specific she feels. As for whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's sort of up to you. Personally, I'm pretty happy with where her kit is just in terms of design, and I expect her true power to shine once we get more solid information on Cyrene. So maybe that's another reason why I'm pretty optimistic on where Evernight ended up, because I expect her to improve even further in the near future. As for how Evernight ended up strength-wise, she's a decent upgrade to Casterus teams under the assumption that you already have Hyacinth. Hyacinth is still the #1 priority for Casterus, but after that, you can replace either RMC or Tribi with Evernight, and your Casterus team will see a decent upgrade. As a solo DPS, I don't think Evernight is outdoing Casterus despite needing to steal Casterus' team, but she can compete against her versus Ice Week content. And as far as Ice main DPS characters go, solo Evernight is stronger than Herta outside of Pure Fiction. And even in Pure Fiction, Evernight still clears it just fine. It's just that Herta clears Pure Fiction a bit more comfortably, which is good, since that should be where Herta shines. All in all, if you're an Evernight fan, I think you should be decently happy with where she ended up, while looking forward to what Cyrene brings for her in the near future. This character still has a lot of room to grow, and who knows how future remembrance characters beyond even Cyrene could continue to affect her. However, with all that said, she definitely is niche in her own right, and she's rather reliant on Hyacinth, which is why I personally have decided to skip Evernight, since she would require me to pull both her and Hyacinth, and potentially even Hyacinth's light cone for maximum potential, which is just a lot of pulls that I would need to invest. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum is Dan Heng PT. This man is basically the opposite of Evernight when it comes to being niche and needing a decent amount of investment. In other words, Dan Heng PT is super flexible, as most sustains are, and he also requires minimal investment. Dan Heng PT is the best generic shielder in the game, obviously mainly competing against Aventurine. I think Aventurine still has situations where he can feel better, mainly against content that does constant AoE hits for constant Aventurine follow-up attacks and shield refreshes, but outside of specific enemy matchups, Dan Heng PT is competing with Hyacinth for being the most comfortable sustain in the game. The hardest difficulties of the new endgame mode, Anomaly Arbitration, feels borderline impossible to survive unless you have either Hyacinth or Dan Heng PT. It helps that the last round of beta changes for Dan Heng PT were focused around increasing his shield strength, but survivability isn't the only thing that makes Dan Dan Heng PT is such a strong generic sustain option. He also grants an attack buff similar in strength to 4-star Ting Yin, which is stronger than Aventurine's crit damage debuff. He also provides his own personal damage, and this damage scales off of the stats of the main DPS of the team, which is why Dan Heng PT doesn't need high investment for himself and can still contribute to the team's damage just fine at low investment. And as if that wasn't enough, he was also basically made to synergize specifically with Sunday while not being reliant or balanced around the synergy. He isn't niche by any means, since he's still perfectly fine without Sunday, but when he is paired with Sunday, who is one of the most widely used supports anyway, Dan Heng PT makes those teams pop off even more with more consistent shield refreshes, as well as enabling every character to make use of the extra 50% damage bonus from Sunday's skill, which usually only applies to characters with a summon. Due to all this, Dan Heng PT is basically a generic sustain unit with some of the strongest sustain potential while providing more damage than other preservation units, and his buffs for the DPS can rival 4-star Ting Yin, a literal harmony character who is still decent in today's meta. Of course, as many of us know, Dan Heng PT used to have a mechanic in his kit where he could trigger the mechanics and passive abilities of other characters if his summon was attached to them, such as triggering Anax's weakness implants or providing energy to Kafka via her tutorial Lycone proccing on his dragon's attacks. And while all of that was removed, thus simplifying his kit by a lot, he's still a very strong character in everything that he provides, both offensively and defensively. In some ways, he feels like a more comfortable Huohuo. Huohuo's team-wide energy is still very strong, especially for energy-reliant teams such as Aglaya and Saber, but Dan Heng PT is able to provide even stronger single target buffs than Huohuo while sustaining better than her and being completely skill point positive compared to Huohuo being more skill point reliant. In that sense, you could think of Dan Heng PT as some sort of mix between Huohuo and Aventurine. He takes the best parts of both of them, that being Huohuo's offensive utility as well as Aventurine's tanky shield and skill point positivity, and combines them into one, all while having a dragon that feels very satisfying whenever it attacks and dishes out decent damage, especially in pure fiction. Overall, Dan Heng PT is just a really good generic sustain for every account. And there are still rumors that he's going to be free, which I really hope will end up being true. There aren't any confirmations as of the current moment. I will say, if he isn't free, then he isn't the highest priority pull for an account, despite how much I've been glazing him here, because at the end of the day, it's not like he's a huge increase for any particular team outside of maybe Anaxa. He's just a general sustain unit that's always good, but not needed by any team. So if he isn't a free character, maybe think twice before going all in for him. But if he is free, and he's this generically good on every account as a free sustain, then that is a huge win on the same level of Archer, who is a free character with really strong damage potential. Hoyo would just continue their track record of releasing really good free male characters, which I think is one of the rare things we can really praise them for. If there is one thing that personally disappointed me with Dan Heng, it would be his lack of synergy with Finan. Don't get me wrong, Dan Heng is still Finan's best sustain, which I guess I have to clarify since my previous video pissed a lot of people off, even though I was literally just stating the truth, but I just had much higher expectations that Dan Heng would at least stack Finan's ultimate better, similarly to how Hyacinth stacks Casterus's ult better than any other character. Dan Heng not being able to live up to those expectations, even as he leaves the beta, does make me quite sad, but the buffs he provides are still really good. He's Finan's best sustain, just not Finan's best teammate, if that makes sense. Which is fine, it's just a little bit disappointing for me. So, Evernight is fairly niche, but not super niche, and she's still very good in her niche as her own standalone DPS. On the other side of things, Dan Heng PT is absolutely not niche, and is just generally great as a sustain unit, with a few particularly standout synergies, such as in Sunday teams. While there were ups and downs throughout the beta for sure, mainly with Dan Heng getting his mechanics stripped away and simplified, and Evernight having her numbers buffed and then nerfed and then changed again, I think both of these characters ended up in a really good spot, and March and Dan Heng fans will get a lot of good use out of both of them. So at the end of the day, I would say both 3.6 characters ended up fairly strong. Again, I'm just still praying that the rumors of Dan Heng being free end up being real, which we should know for sure if he is or not during the upcoming 3.6 livestream. But that's just my thoughts. What do you think about how Evernight and Dan Heng ended up? Are you happy with their power levels? Or are you disappointed because you wanted more from the two companions who have been with us since the start of the game? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable. There's plenty more content on the way, including the aforementioned guides for Evernight and Dan Heng, so subscribe to the channel to make sure you don't miss out on those. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you're looking forward to patch 3.6 as much as I am. Until next time!